Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, let me, before I get into the arguments, I'm going to quote here from actually a friend of mine who is very strongly pro-abortion. He's a professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder. His name is David Boonin. And if you want to read, I wrote a very extensive critique of his book. He wrote a book called A Defense of Abortion, which came out about 8 years ago now with Cambridge University Press. I wrote a review of it in the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy. You can go to my website, francisbeckwith.com, and download it for free. It's probably the best defense of abortion that I've ever read. My own book, which came out 5 years later, is most of it's a critique of David's work on this. And so we've sort of gone, and in his book he deals with some of my articles, so we've been going back and forth now for about 15 years on this issue. But this is what David says in a very candid admission at the beginning of his book. And I'm going to read this slowly in order for you to really understand the logic of this position. This is what Professor Boonin says. On the desk in my office, where most of this book was written and revised, there are several pictures of my son Eli. In one, he is gleefully dancing on the sand along the Gulf of Mexico, the cool ocean breeze wreaking havoc with his wispy hair. In the top drawer of my desk, I keep another picture of Eli. The picture was taken September 7th, 1993, 24 weeks before he was born. So he's 16 weeks gestation. The sonogram image is murky, but it reveals clearly enough a small head tilted back slightly and toward the mouth. There is no doubt in my mind that this picture, too, shows the same little boy at a very early stage in his physical development, and there is no question that the position I defend in this book entails that it would have been morally permissible to end his life at this point. Did you hear that? I mean, I feel sorry for David because he gets this quote, everybody quotes this now. I mean, it's really one of the, basically what he's saying is that my child, Eli, who's born in 19, by the end of 93, he's over 16 years old. Probably he's going to be going into college next year. He's going to have to read his dad's article, right? Or at least read a mine article where I quote his dad. But it's fascinating because here he puts in very bold words, this is precisely the position I defend. That is, even though I believe that sonogram photograph, the being in that photograph is identical to this being that was born, who is also running in this other picture. I believe that it would be permissible to kill him at this other point. And what I want to do for the next 15, 20 minutes is to deal with the kind of David Boonin argument and how to respond to it. Now, in order to do that, I want to sort of set it up by explaining what I think is the correct way, or at least one way to explain the pro-life position, and to explain it in a way that I think gets to the heart of what we mean when we say that the unborn is, in fact, one of us. According to the pro-life position, the unborn is a human being insofar as belonging to the species Homo sapiens. I'm sorry, that's actually the other position. I was going to quote, boy, you guys were going to be freaked out if I had continued. Given the facts of embryology and fetal development, at conception, a whole human being with its own genetic code comes into existence needing only food, water, shelter, and oxygen, and a congenial environment in which to interact in order to grow and develop itself to maturity in accordance with its own intrinsically ordered nature. Now, let me just say very briefly what I mean by that. When we talk about human beings being identical to themselves over time, which is essentially what I'm saying here, we differentiate human beings from artifacts. What's an artifact? A chair, a clock, a book. Those are things that are collections of parts. And you literally, when you remove a part from one of these things and replace it with something else, it literally becomes something else. So, for example, I use this in my classes. Imagine if every day I replaced a part from my car, and then in another part of my garage I rebuilt it with those parts. Which one's the original car? would it be the one where all the parts? No, we think, because those sorts of things are not organisms with their own intrinsic nature. They're just stuff that we impose order on. Organisms, human beings, dogs and cats, all these sorts of things are things that remain identical to themselves yet change over time. And it's a kind of mystery. I mean, this is why you can look at a photograph of yourself from, let's say, I turned 50 this year, so supposing I look at a photo, my mom has a picture of me when I was 1, without any clothes on, looking out like this. Not when I was 48, that'd be kind of weird. But I was 1, and I can say, that's me. And yet, the physical, there's I've lost and gained those parts over time, at least on the cellular level. Yet I'm identical to myself. So organisms are like that. So let me continue. Like the infant, the child, and the adolescent, the conceptus, that is the entity brought into being at conception, is a being who is in the process of unfolding its potential, the potential to grow and develop itself, but not to change what it is. This being, because of its nature, is actively disposed to develop into a mature version of herself, though never ceasing to be herself. Thus, the same human being that begins as a zygote continues to exist to its birth and through its adulthood, unless disease or violence stops it from doing so. For there is no decisive break in this physical organism's continuous development from conception until death, from which one can reasonably infer that the being undergoes a substantial change and literally ceases to exist. What's a substantial change? For those who have studied Thomas Aquinas, you know what I'm talking about. Substantial change means that the thing ceases to be and its parts are part of something else. So these bleachers here are made out of a tree which underwent substantial change and became bleachers. Actually, it didn't really become bleachers. It ceased to be, and its parts are used for the bleachers. Right? It's not really a tree anymore, just maybe the parts of the tree. That's a substantial change. The fetus never goes through a substantial change unless it were to die. If it continues to live, it undergoes change, but it remains the same thing as it develops. All right. Thus, a human being is a unified organism from conception. Each human being has powers and capacities according to its nature, and organisms remain identical to themselves as they undergo change. That's the pro-life position. That is, we fully acknowledge that human beings, over time, lose and gain parts, lose and gain abilities. People differ in their powers and capacities. Some people are smarter than others. Some people are more rational than others. Some people are more athletic than others. I mean, we differ in a wide range of ways, but we have one thing in common. What we have in common is we share the same nature. And by sharing that same nature, we in fact, that's where we ground our equality, because that's the only thing that we can actually point to that we all have in common, that we share equally. Everything else, and this is, I think, ultimately the problem with the position that David defends and others, is they usually try to focus on some power that human beings have, usually during their adulthood, like something like rationality. And so David actually, without getting into too much detail, suggests this criterion, that you become a person when you have organized cortical brain activity. What's that? Well, it's when your cerebral cortex reaches a certain level of complexity so that you can have desires. And so when you have a right to life, when you actually have the present ability to desire a right to life. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, there are several problems with it, and I'm going to go over them in some detail. One problem, and by the way, Boonin's argument is one version among many. There are some philosophers who try to locate it in having a self-concept. The problem with that is that actually then justifies infanticide. Because having a self-concept is something that children really don't acquire until about 18 months after birth. This is why Peter Singer, the notorious professor at Princeton, as opposed to the great professor at Princeton, Robbie George, who was here not too long ago, defends the permissibility of infanticide. He takes the logic of his position. David doesn't want to go that far. And most philosophers who want to defend abortion rights don't want to go as far as Singer. So they try to come up with some way to allow most abortions, but at the same time, not allow infanticide. The problem is it's a very difficult thing to do. And Singer, I think, at least is, I think, in some ways, the most honest and candid of them, even though his position is one that people recoil in horror when they hear. In any event, Boonin offers this understanding, making the argument that it's this arrangement of parts in the brain that at a certain level of complexity means that you have the power to desire things. What's wrong with that? A couple of problems. One, it really can't account for clear-cut counterexamples. Let me give you an clear-cut counterexample. It's an example that I've used in my book, Defending Life, as well as a few articles. It's my Uncle Jed example. For those who are Beverly Hillbillies fans, you know Uncle Jed is. I love the Beverly Hillbillies. It's just like filled with so many kernels of wisdom, right? Granny, Ellie Mae couldn't cook. In any event, I know too much about sitcoms from the 1960s. So, in any event, let's say you have an Uncle Jed, and your Uncle Jed is in a car accident. You know, especially that crummy car that he drove. You know, you can easily imagine. You know, if he got in an accident, he'd be hurled across, lanes of traffic or something. And supposing he's in an accident and he's in a coma, and the doctors tell you, look, Uncle Jed's going to come out of the coma, but when he comes out, he's going to, he may not remember everything, but he'll remember some things, and he may take some time, but he'll reacquire some of his abilities, but it's going to take some time. Most people would say, okay, it would be wrong to kill Uncle Jed during the coma, right? Because at least, he's going to come out of it a little damaged, but he'll eventually regain his abilities. But let's change the story a bit. Imagine if the doctor tells you, look, Uncle Jed is going to come out of the coma, but I've got some news that it's not going to be pleasant to hear. He's going to come out of it, but when he comes out, he will have lost all his memories, all his abilities. Essentially, he will be in precisely the same position as the standard fetus. That is, he'll have to actually learn a language and have to be trained, and it's going to have to take as long as an ordinary life. Maybe it'll take a year or two. The question is it right to kill Uncle Jed in the coma? And my argument is that it isn't. And the reason for that is that the reason why is when we think of Uncle Jed and his intrinsic dignity, we don't locate it in his present ability to do things. We locate it in the sort of being he is. And in a situation like that, we clearly recognize the sort of being he is. And it doesn't matter whether he's going to regain everything or not. Okay? The other problem with Boonin's argument is this. And by the way, in the article where I critique David, I contrast Uncle Jed with another uncle, Uncle Herb, Uncle Herb is going to come out of the coma, but he's going to have a few abilities. And so my point to contrast them is to show that if, in fact, we're going to hinge the right to life on these degrees, what that means is then we have to ask the question, well, what about people that are fully conscious and fully flourishing? I mean, we know people who are geniuses, right? Like Stephen Hawking, right? Just came out with this book apparently showing that God not only doesn't exist, but he can't exist, which is just, and it's a very strange. I've not read it. I've read some excerpts from it. But Steve, that's a really smart guy, right? There are a lot of people like Jethro who aren't that smart, right? And from the Beverly Hillbillies, and Jethro and Stephen. I mean, does that mean Stephen Hawking has a greater right to life because he seems to have a greater number of intellectual abilities? I mean, once you start locating a right to life based on degreed properties, and that's what this is, a degreed property, then you have to then raise the question of why people couldn't have greater rights based on these degreed properties. The other problem with David Boonin's argument is that, and this is going to sound like a very strange objection, but bear with me, is that he can't account for the wrong of intentionally creating brainless children. Now, what does that mean?